The auctioneer's gavel came down on a crate outside the Juniper Draw land office, and Clara Doyle watched her whole life get sold for the price of a saddle horse. Sold, the man called, to Otis Prout, for the sum of $400. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd gathered in the dust, because everyone in Juniper Draw knew $400 would not have covered the cost of the barn roof Thomas had raised with his own 2 hands the summer before he died. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd in her one good black dress, gloved hands, folded so tightly the seams bit into her palms, and made herself watch. She would not look away. She would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had buried Thomas 11 months before, after the fever took him quick and cruel in a single bad week, and she had spent every one of those 11 months keeping the ranch running on her own 2 hands rather than ask the town for pity, mending fence, doctoring stock, selling eggs and preserves in town to make the note payments she believed, until 3 weeks ago, were not even due yet. She had done everything right. It had not mattered. "Won't fetch much crying over spilled milk, Widow Doyle," Otis Prout said, ambling toward her with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, already talking about her home as though it were a shirt he'd bought off a peg. "Bank tells me the note came due sudden-like. Shame how these things happen to a woman alone." "The note wasn't due for another year," Clara said, and her voice did not shake, though everything else in her wanted to. "I have the papers Thomas signed. I have kept every one." "Papers change, ma'am," Prout said, and smiled with all his teeth, and turned back to the crowd to accept congratulations on his bargain, and Clara understood, watching him go, that no one intended to ask her a single question about it. A widow's word was worth exactly as much as the men of Juniper Draw decided to let it be worth, and today they had decided it was worth nothing at all. She was still standing there, alone in the thinning crowd, when a stranger on a big raw-boned bay walked his horse straight up to the auctioneer's crate and said, in a voice that did not need to be raised to carry, "I'll give you 600 for it." The auctioneer blinked. Prout's grin died on his face like a snuffed lamp. "Sale's done, mister," gavelled and closed. "Then ungavel it," the stranger said, swinging down from the saddle unhurried, as if he had all the patience in the world, and none of the temper the moment seemed to call for. He was a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 35, sun-weathered, plainly dressed but for good boots, with eyes the gray of a coming storm and a stillness about him that made the crowd quiet without his raising his voice at all. "County law says a public auction stays open to bid until the papers are signed and the money's in the clerk's hand. I've watched Otis Prout's business dealings before. I'll not watch this one finish crooked. $600, and I'll have my own lawyer look over that note before a dollar changes hands." Clara did not know him. She had heard the name Dalton Fry spoken with respect 2 valleys over, a rancher who ran good cattle and paid his hands fair and kept mostly to himself, but she had never once laid eyes on him, and she could not think why a stranger would spend $200 and make an enemy of Otis Prout over a debt that wasn't his to settle. The crowd murmured. Prout's face went the color of raw meat, and he blustered about a done deal and a lawful sale. But the auctioneer, sweating now under every eye in Juniper Draw, said that $600 was $600, and the gavel had not, strictly, been wetted with ink yet, and if Mr. Prout wished to raise his bid he was welcome to. Prout did not raise his bid. Whatever game he had thought he was playing, it was not one he cared to play against a man willing to spend real money in front of a crowd. He mounted his horse and rode off calling it robbery, and the auctioneer, looking flustered and faintly relieved to have an excuse, gavelled the sale to Dalton Fry for $600, and just like that, Clara's home belonged to a man she had never spoken to in her life. She meant to walk away with what dignity she had left. She had her trunk already loaded on Abigail Renner's wagon, a room waiting above the boarding house that she could not truly afford, and no plan beyond getting through the next hour without weeping in front of the whole town. But the stranger crossed the yard toward her before she reached the wagon, hat in hand, and said, "Mrs. Doyle, I'm sorry for the manner of it. I'd have bid quieter if there'd been a way to do it quiet." "You didn't need to bid at all," she said, more sharply than she intended. "It isn't your ranch to rescue, Mr. Fry. I don't know you." "No," he agreed, "you don't, but I knew your husband a little from the cattlemen's meetings in Cross Timbers, and I know Otis Pruitt a good deal more than I'd like, and I did not care for the smell of this sale." His eyes were steady on her, not unkind, not pitying either, which surprised her more than anything else he'd said. "I've no interest in putting a widow out of her home, ma'am. I bought the note, not you. Give me a week to have my lawyer go over Thomas's papers, and if it's all clean and square, I'll be looking to hire good help for the place regardless of what the law says about who holds the deed." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his weathered face for whatever angle Pruitt would have hidden there, and found, to her own unease, that she could not locate one. "Why would you do that?" "Because a debt that wasn't due got called due awful conveniently. The weak Coyle Enterprises started buying up water rights along the draw," Dalton said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "and I mean to find out why." That night in the narrow room above the boarding house, Clara lay awake listening to the wind work at the shutters, and told herself she would not hope for anything from a stranger's charity. Hope, in her experience, was a debt that always came due at the worst possible hour. She had hoped once that Thomas's cough would pass with the spring thaw. She had hoped the bank would extend the note through harvest. Hope had never once paid her back for the trouble of feeling it. But 3 days later, Dalton Fry rode into town again, and this time he brought a lawyer from the county seat, a narrow, precise man named Fenwick, who spread Thomas's papers across the boarding house's good table and traced through the figures with a finger stained by ink, and pronounced, at the end of an hour, that the note Otis Pruitt had presented to the bank bore a due date altered in a hand that was not Thomas Doyle's. "Forged," Fenwick said. "Badly, at that. Whoever changed the 1891 to 1890 wasn't much of a hand at matching ink. I'd stake my license on it." Clara sat very still with her hands in her lap, while the two men talked over her head about depositions, and the circuit judge's next visit to Juniper Draw, and felt something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in the whole slow year of losing Thomas, and then losing the roof over her head, something that was not quite hope yet, but stood very near its door. Fenwick left the papers spread on the table a while longer, tracing the altered digit again under the lamp, as though he still could not quite believe a man had been so careless, and Clara found herself studying Dalton Fry instead. The set of his jaw, the way his big hands stayed still and careful on the table's edge, as if he had trained himself young not to make sudden movements around frightened things. She had expected, when Pruitt rode off cursing at the auction, that the stranger who had outbid him would want something from her before the week was out. Every kindness she had been offered since Thomas died had come with a hook buried somewhere inside it. The banker's sympathetic smile before he called the note, the neighbor women's soft words before they stopped inviting her to Quilting Circle. She kept waiting for Dalton Fry's hook to show itself, and it did not, and the waiting unsettled her almost more than Pruitt's cruelty had. "Who benefits," she made herself ask, "from taking my land a year early?" "Coyle," Dalton said. "He's been buying every parcel that touches the draw for 2 years, quiet-like, through Pruitt and men like him, because whoever holds the water rights along that stretch controls grazing for 40 miles when the railroad spur goes through next spring. Your husband's 40 acres sat square in the middle of what he needed. I expect Pruitt was paid handsomely to see the note called early, and the land sold cheap before anyone thought to ask questions. "And you," Clara said, "what do you get from it, Mr. Fry, besides a lawyer's bill and Otis Prout for an enemy?" Dalton was quiet a moment, turning his hat in his hands the way a man does when he means to say something honest and isn't sure yet how it will land. "My own place backs onto the draw a mile north. If Coyle closes off that water, my cattle go thirsty same as yours would have. I won't pretend I came here purely for your sake, ma'am, but I'll not pretend either that watching Otis Prout crow over a stolen widow's homestead sat easy with me. Some things a man can't ride past and still call himself decent." It was not romance, what he offered her that week. It was work, hard, unglamorous work of building a case, and Clara found herself riding out to the ranch that had been hers, and was now, on paper, his, to walk Fenwick through every fence line Thomas had built and every water right her grandfather-in-law had filed 40 years before. She had expected to feel like a trespasser on her own land. Instead, Dalton treated her like the one person in the county who actually knew the place, deferring to her memory of where the good spring ran even in drought, asking her opinion on which pasture Thomas had meant to fence next. And slowly, without her quite noticing the turn of it, Clara began to look forward to the ride out from town. The first time he'd offered her a wage to come tell Fenwick what she knew, she had refused flat out, standing in the boarding-house parlor with her chin up like a woman refusing charity, because taking his money for knowledge of her own land felt like one indignity, too many stacked atop the others. "I'll tell your lawyer what he needs to know free of charge, Mr. Fry, and be glad to see Otis Prout answer for it. But I'll not be paid to walk my own fence lines like a hired girl." "Then don't take it as wages," Dalton had said, patient as a man gentling a green colt. "Take it as what it is. A debt I owe you for the trouble my $600 caused you in that square, whether I meant the trouble or not." She had taken the money in the end, because Abigail's boarding-house rent did not care one way or the other about her pride. But she had noted, turning the coins over that night, that he had found a way to let her keep both the help and the dignity, which was more consideration than most men in Juniper Draw had shown her since Thomas's funeral. There was a woman in town, too, who did not care for how often Clara rode out to the Fry place, Delphine Ashby, whose father owned the feed store and who had, by her own frequent telling, been expecting Dalton Fry to come courting her come autumn. Delphine cornered Clara outside the mercantile one bright, ordinary morning and said, sweet as spoiled milk, that some women didn't seem to know when a man was only being neighborly out of pity, and that it was a shame to watch a widow make such a public fool of herself chasing a ranch she'd already lost once. Clara had felt the old flush of shame rise in her throat, the same one that had near choked her at the auction, and had very nearly apologized for existing, the way she had trained herself to do all that long grieving year. But she thought of Abigail's words about gavels and worth, and instead she only said, mild as milk herself, that she would let Mr. Fry speak for his own intentions when he was good and ready, and that in her experience a man who meant pity did not spend $200 and a lawyer's fee proving it. Delphine had gone red and flounced off, and Clara had walked home feeling, for the first time in a year, something almost like triumph. The town, for its part, was not so quick to change its mind. Juniper Draw had watched her lose her home in a public square and had mostly enjoyed the show. Now it watched her ride out to that same home 3 and 4 days a week on the buyer's invitation, and it drew its own conclusions, none of them kind. Mrs. Iverson at the mercantile stopped speaking to her outright. Someone she never learned who left a note under the boarding-house door calling her a woman with no more shame than a Sunday hen, and Clara burned it in the stove and did not tell Dalton, because she was proud, and because some hurts a woman keeps to herself out of habit, long after the reason for the habit has stopped making sense. It was Abigail Renner, wringing out laundry in the boarding house yard, who finally said what needed saying. "You're letting them shame you twice over the same sin, Clara Doyle, and the sin wasn't even yours the first time. That man rides 40 minutes out of his day to fetch you to your own porch and treats you the whole while like your opinion is the only one in the county worth having, and you're going to let Verna Iverson's tongue talk you out of noticing it." "I don't know what he wants from me," Clara admitted, low. "A dead man's widow with no dowry and a ruined name isn't much of a prize, Abigail." "Then maybe," Abigail said, "he isn't shopping for a prize. Maybe he's just a decent man who noticed a fine woman being treated like dirt and can't abide it." She wrung the shirt hard enough to crack like a whip. "You've spent a year thinking your worth got auctioned off with the barn. It didn't. Nobody can gavel that away, honey, unless you let them." Clara turned those words over on the long ride out the next morning, and turned them over again when she found Dalton on the porch that had once been hers. Mending a hinge on the door Thomas had hung crooked and never fixed, whistling low and tuneless the way a man does when he thinks himself alone. He looked up and the whistling stopped, and something in his face when he saw her standing at the gate made her chest go tight and warm at once. An unfamiliar feeling she was slow to put a name to because she had gone so long without needing the word. "I came to ask you something," she said, before her nerve could fail her. "Plainly, since you've been playing with me, do you mean to sell this place back once the fraud's proven, or hire me on as you said, or is there some third thing you've been circling around and haven't said?" Dalton set down the hinge and the hammer both, slow, and looked at her the way a man looks at a fence line he means to build something against. "There's a third thing," he admitted. "I've been circling it a month now, afraid if I said it plain you'd think I meant to buy you the way Prout tried to buy your land cheap, and thinking myself owed something for the price. I don't. Whatever you decide about this place, the deed's already half in your name with Fenwick's papers signed, fraud proven or not, because it was never rightly mine to keep. But I'll say the third thing anyway since you've asked plain. I'd like it if you stayed, not as hired help, as my wife, if you'd have me, and this ranch as the home it was always meant to be yours and mine, and neither of us keeping count of who paid what to earn it." Clara had imagined, in the year since Thomas died, a great many futures for herself, most of them narrow and gray and short on anything like joy. She had not imagined this one a stubborn, careful man handing her back her own home and asking, instead of telling, whether she wanted to share it with him. "You'd have the whole town whispering that Dalton Fry married himself a scandal," she said, though her voice had gone unsteady. "Let them whisper," he said. "I've buried better opinions than juniper draws." She might have answered him fully that same hour, had Otis Prout not chosen that same week to make his last, worst play. It came at night, 10 days later, with the circuit judge's arrival still a week off, and Fenwick's forged note evidence locked in the bank's own safe awaiting the hearing. In the days before it, Clara had let herself believe the worst of the trouble was behind them, Prout gone quiet, Coyle's name whispered but unproven, the town's tongues slowly wearing themselves out on newer gossip. She should have known better. Trouble in Juniper Draw had a way of waiting until a body let its guard down before it struck, same as it had waited until Thomas was a year in his grave, before calling due a note that was not yet owed. Clara woke in the boarding house to the sound of a horse driven hard through the dark and Abigail pounding on her door, saying the Fry place was afire, the hay barn, and men seen riding off from it, and Dalton himself out in the smoke trying to save the stock alone. She did not stop for a coat. She rode out bareback on Abigail's plow mare with her nightdress tucked up and her heart going like a hammer on an anvil, and came over the last rise to find the barn a wall of orange light against the black sky, and Dalton, soot-blackened, dragging a bawling calf clear of a collapsing stall, while two shapes on horseback sat at the tree line watching, unhurried, as if they had come to watch a job finished rather than lend a hand to stop it. "Prute's men," Dalton called to her, coughing smoke, when she flung herself down beside him. "Meant to burn me out of caring what happens to your land or scare me off testifying to the fraud. Get back, Clara, there's a beam about too." She did not get back. She waded into the smoke beside him instead, because she had spent a year being told to stand at the edge of things and watch her life get decided without her, and she was finished with it. She caught the frightened calf's rope where it had tangled, hauled it free with strength she had not known she still had in her, and together they got the last of the stock out into the night air before the roof came down in a roar of sparks that lit the whole valley red. The two riders at the tree line, seeing the fire fail to do its work, and seeing besides that a fresh set of hands had ridden hard from town to bear witness against them, wheeled and fled before Dalton's ranch hands, roused by the light, could reach them with rifles and rope. They stood afterward in the ash-smelling dark, coughing, singed, alive, and Dalton took her soot-streaked face in both his hands with a gentleness that undid her more than the fire had. "You could have stayed clear," he said, hoarse. "So could you," Clara said. "Seems we're neither of us much good at standing back and watching." "No," he agreed, and kissed her there in the wreck of his barn with the embers still glowing behind them, soft and certain. The first kiss either of them had allowed themselves, and it tasted of smoke and of something that was not fear at all. Behind them the ranch hands were already dousing the last stubborn flames and calming the rescued stock, and somewhere in the dark, a rooster, confused by the false dawn of firelight, crowed once into the settling smoke, and Clara laughed despite herself, a startled, unguarded sound she had not made once in the whole long year of her grief. The fire, in the end, proved the last nail in Otis Prute's coffin rather than in Dalton's resolve. The two riders were caught before dawn trying to sell singed tack in cross timbers, and under the sheriff's questioning, they gave up Prute's name inside the hour, and Prute, cornered, gave up coils in turn, hoping to trade one noose for a lighter one. The circuit judge, arriving a week later to a county already buzzing with the whole ugly business, needed less than a day to void the fraudulent note, return Thomas Doyle's 40 acres to his widow's clear and rightful title, and bind Prute over for trial on forgery besides. Coyle's railroad money evaporated from the county overnight, the water rights scheme with it, and the town of Juniper Draw, which had gathered eagerly to watch a widow humiliated in the square not 2 months before, gathered again to watch her stand in that same square while the judge restored her name and her land in the same breath. Verna Iverson, of all people, was the first to come forward afterward and say she'd always known there was something crooked about that sale, which made Abigail laugh so hard she had to sit down on the mercantile steps, and Clara, standing beside Dalton with her land legally hers again, and his ring newly on her finger, found she could not even summon anger enough to mind the woman's late and convenient courage. She had all she wanted already. They were married in October, in the little chapel at Juniper Draw, with Abigail weeping happily in the front pew and half. The county turned out to see the widow they had once sold for $400 stand up in her own church, in her own town, and marry a man who had never once asked her to be grateful for anything he'd done. The ranch stood rebuilt by spring. The new barn raised with lumber Dalton insisted on paying for out of his own pocket, though the deed said the land was every bit as much hers as his. And folks who rode past on the road to cross timbers took to remarking, without any of the old cruelty in it now, that Dalton Fry's wife ran the finest little spread along the whole of Juniper Draw. and that a man would be hard put to find a smarter or steadier woman to share it with. Delphine Ashby, to everyone's mild surprise, was among the women who brought a covered dish to the wedding supper, and allowed, stiffly but sincerely, that she supposed some men simply knew their own minds, and there was no shaming them out of it. Clara accepted the dish, and the apology both with more grace than she might have managed a year before, because she had learned by then that holding a grudge took more strength than she cared to spend on people who had already been proven wrong by better witnesses than her own temper. Clara stood on the porch some evenings, in the last gold light before supper, with Dalton's step sounding behind her on the boards he'd mended with his own hands, and thought of the auctioneer's gavel coming down on her whole life for the price of a saddle horse, and marveled quietly at how a single stubborn man's refusal to ride past a wrong had built her, out of that wreckage, a home no one could ever again call anyone's but her own. She had come to understand in the year since that a woman's worth was never truly decided at any auction, however loud the gavel, only, in the end, by who stayed to prove it and who rode away.